And welcome to this very latest and very special episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and editor and founder of its sister site, the EV Focus sister site, The Driven. And joining me as usual is ITK principal David Leitch. And David, I think this is the first time we've actually been in a proper studio, isn't it?
One of the first. We've been on stage at Smart Energy and various places, and I think a West Australian mining conference, which was a huge amount of fun. But this is the first studio in Brisbane I've been in, and it's in some ways it's a shame it has to come in my podcasting career rather than when I was going to be a musician. But but I think everyone else is fairly grateful. And haven't we got a great guest today?
Yeah, we do. Look, we're actually very honoured. Josef Tadich, the head of Tesla Energy in Australia and the Asia Pacific. Josef, welcome to the podcast. And it's not often that Tesla senior executives get let out to talk like this.
Not that often, but yeah, thank you, Giles, and thank you, David. Great to be here face to face. I think the last time I saw you was out surfing on the Point.
Up at the Point and at the pass, that's
yeah,
right.
The pass,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so was it the Watercoast as well? Or one? That might have been another occasion. Yeah, excellent. Look, so much to talk about, and Tesla, fascinating, played such a key role in the energy transition. It's often easy to forget that you guys, like less than a decade ago, you were the first employee of Tesla Energy in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. I'm actually coming up to the 10th anniversary, November. So 2015, first Tesla Energy employee. And that was pretty much straight after we launched the energy program at Tesla and the Powerwall 1, which, if you remember, was a DC-coupled 3-kilowatt battery.
Yeah.
So lots changed since then, that's for sure.
Well, lots changed since then, and it's just all leapt in leaps and bounds in the last year, which we'll get to, like $2.5 billion in revenue now in Tesla Energy. And it's actually the first country in the world, I think, where energy revenues has actually overtaken
that's right.
car revenues.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've seen that trend. Has been an amazing trend over the years. In fact, in the early days, Australia was one of the only market, or the only market, where there were more Powerwalls than vehicles in the market. Right, other countries have kind of been the inverse of that.
And now up to 100,000 Powerwalls, I think.
Yeah. We just hit the 1 million milestone, and a bit over 10% of that's operating right here.
Yes, and I hope Australia's the last market where energy sales exceed car sales from Tesla's perspective. Sorry, I just it's the analyst in me that makes me.
I think Elon Musk actually predicted this, that energy was going to be a bigger business than cars.
No, he did.
But,
he did.
And he keeps on saying that. Maybe not bigger than autonomy. But let's just take us back to that 10 years ago.
Yeah, right.
You're sitting there, alone in your office, presumably. I don't know. But batteries. I mean, take us through what it was like then, talking to people about batteries. And then through, because Australia was, of course, the very first Tesla big battery. It got built just after the blackout.
That's right.
After a series of tweets between Elon Musk and Mike Cannon-Brookes. And
we all know the story.
And things like that. But just tell us from your perspective, because you played a key role in all of that.
Yeah, no, exactly. We started in 2015, and I joined from the wind industry at the time because I could definitely see at the time that there's a limit of how much semi-scheduled generation.
So if we go back even further than that, weren't you doing Engineers Without Boundaries or something like Without Borders?
Yeah, Engineers Without Borders. Yeah, I started my career in the Navy as an engineering officer on the helicopter programs and gas turbines, and then had a bit of a career change of heart and went to Engineers Without Borders.
Was that interesting? I'm interested in people who make these efforts, because I don't think that's a really well-paid job, is it?
It was $0.
$0. And where did you work there?
Yeah, so I had about 4 months in Kathmandu, or just out of Kathmandu, at Kathmandu University, a place called Dulakel. And we were trying to do rural electrification at the time. So we were doing small 12-volt batteries, and we were hand laminating little generators for wind turbines, and it was kind of fun. And then went from there to wind industry.
Yes.
And because my skill set was originally when helicopter programs, helicopter aerodynamics and control systems, and at the time that was a massive boom in the wind industry. And rotor diameters were getting bigger and bigger. And that was transferable through to, and I went to Europe, to Denmark, and did offshore wind and onshore wind. And in fact, the control systems between a helicopter and a wind turbine are quite similar. So that
I've been in a helicopter, but I haven't. I've seen some great photos of people sitting up the top of wind turbines.
Yeah, there's a few of those.
But I haven't done that. Giles, sorry to interrupt.
Yep, thank you.
Got off topic. That didn't take long, did it?
No, that's okay. No, it's actually really fascinating.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But I want to get back to that very first Tesla big battery
Yeah.
after that blackout.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Elon says we can build a big battery in 100 days.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
were you sort of sitting in the office and saying, can we?
Oh, I remember the day. I definitely remember the day. Yeah, so 2015 we started. We had the Powerwall program and with small power packs. And the original power packs we thought were big. They were 50 kilowatts, 100 kilowatt hours, right? They were the biggest things we made at that point. And we did a few small-scale C&I projects back then. Then there was the blackout 2016, and that was a pivotal moment, I think, in the NEM, in how we viewed the energy transition. And that's when, the 100 megawatt battery came through. And there was a tender. We thought it was going to end up with a couple of 50 megawatt batteries, but then when we got the full 100 megawatt battery, there was a little bit of stunned silence in the room. I do remember, because at the time it was a half-hour battery. Up until that point, everyone was really focused on the short duration batteries because the focus at the time was really, if you remember, ancillary services and the FCAS regulation market and competition in the SA.
So basically frequency control.
Frequency control, exactly.
And that market's continued to develop now to the point as we move from a market that's had rotating mass for inertia to an inverter-driven market, more or less.
Yeah, there's been some fundamental changes in the power system. So, and then, at the time, we had very limited time to design that system, right? Very limited time. We had a great partnership with NeoN. They had the Hornsdale wind farm, and they actually had a spare 275 kV transformer just sitting there. So for the banks made them have that as a reserve, and so we're like, done. So we designed the 100 megawatt layout. I think we did it in like 10 days or something.
Wow.
And then with CPP, we got the EPC up, and when we won the tender, we were straight into it. And it was all hands on deck. And look, we learned a lot. We scaled, right? Up until that point, I think the largest battery head was around 20 megawatts, which was in Southern California. And going from 20 megawatts to 100 megawatts, they're around about 212 inverters, roughly, and thousands of battery modules. So we had to scale up the technology such that we could coordinate from the comm systems, having all of those batteries operating at the same time. Because the key with a large-scale battery is you need to make sure that they're all of the batteries, because there's a whole squadron of them, are operating at exactly the same time point. Otherwise, you don't hit your power target, you don't hit your energy target. So that was a challenge, and we scaled up what we call the site controller, and we did a whole bunch of stuff on the power electronics to get there. And the proof was in the pudding when we hit that 100 megawatt whole point test.
And at that point, there wasn't any software like auto bidder software or anything like that. How did you determine the dispatching?
Yeah, so that was actually what created the auto bidder product, actually. So when we did that, we realized, because we were forced, the innovation we were forced into that, because at the time it was a 30-minute requirement, but the smallest battery the shortest duration battery we had was around about 2 hours. We ran that slightly higher, the power on that, but there was additional energy which we needed to use in the energy market, right? Because you couldn't just rely on the battery just on a capacity contract. It didn't really work. So it had to be in the ancillary service market, energy market. So to do that, particularly in Australia, you need a co-optimized energy dispatch, right? And so that was the auto bidder. That was the birth of auto bidder. It had been going for a little bit before that, but that was that's where we tested it. And
so at the time that you were kind of pushing the boundaries of what people thought was possible in the grid, including the operator and some of the networks and things like that, and to a certain extent now, because the battery storage industry and the technology has evolved, so you're still pushing the boundaries and still trying to change people's minds about how a system can operate. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. And that I really think that was really a step change, I think, in the industry. And I still remember the day post the tender award. We went to the AEMO. I went to the AEMO office, and Audrey Silverman was there, and Damien Sanford was the head of operations there at AEMO. And I remember walking into the room, and they're all looking. They're like skeptical. They're like, these guys have promised a 100 megawatt battery. What are they going to do? And we went through how the design assumption, how we're going to meet the automatic access requirements for the inverters, and we did size it correctly. And look, hats off to AEMO, because they really pushed, and we had to redefine the way a generator worked in the NEM. Up until that point, like the scheduled load, it wasn't a controllable load, right? So how do you go from plus 30 megawatts to minus 60 megawatts so quickly? And that was a forcing function. Yeah. And I think AEMO was really led the way there in the way the system as a system operator. And I think every system operator in the world was watching. Everyone. So I think there's a lot of pressure to do that, but we paved the way.
I think it's underestimated how much the world does look at Australia, because we've got this huge behind the meter and thin grid. And if we jump forward to today, so we were talking about 100 megawatts of 30 minutes, so 50 megawatt hours more or less. Yep. And how big's the battery market, utility battery market, going to be here in the NEM in another 2 years, do you reckon?
Yeah, well, it depends on the crystal ball. But if you look at the AMO ISP, the 2024 ISP, which I think is a very good crystal ball. I think we need to be in that space of like 20 to 30 gigawatts of scheduled.
We'll have
capacity.
that. I mean, I can identify 20 over 20 gigawatts of batteries under construction, commissioning, or in operation. Plus, I think we're going to get another 10 gigawatt hours out of the home battery scheme as well. Yep. So I can see us up around 30 gigawatt hours or something easily.
Oh, absolutely. I think, look, if we look at our fleet, we're probably 3.5 gigawatt hours operating now in Australia. We have another 10. We should be 15 to 20 gigawatt hours into next year. Tesla alone.
End of next year?
Yeah.
20 gigawatt hours. Because you're building the biggest battery at the moment at Collie, which is 2,240 megawatt hours.
About that with Collie 2, yeah.
Collie 2, that's right. Well, yeah, together.
So the combined site would be, yeah. I mean, these are big projects now, right? Yeah. Big, huge projects.
And so we were talking a little bit before we went on air. There's a lot of aspects to it, but let's just talk about the skills requirement and the productivity improvement, because I think you were saying that there was something like 30 people that contributed, that commissioned this original Hornsdale battery. And how many does it take now to commission a much bigger battery?
Yeah, I do remember it. Yeah, at Hornsdale there was definitely quite a few people, quite a few engineers, and we actually had the original, at the time, which was crazy thinking about it, is we had the original inverter design team from the US were there in the field commissioning the inverters, and it was like, it was crazy. But now with the scale of it, and there's been a lot of streamlining in terms of, and again, AMO and the TNSPs have worked pretty hard over the last 10 years for sure, is to converge on those whole point test requirements and objectively what we need to demonstrate. And because there's a little bit more confidence now, I think a lot of those tests can be almost automated, right? So for about a 100 megawatt battery compared to a 300 megawatt battery, the amount of time, the difference is minimal, right? So we need a team of like 2 to 3 to run the commissioning and the whole point testing roughly.
And I'm interested because as an analyst, again, how long now does it take from the time you start a commissioning on a battery to when it's fully operational?
Yeah.
As a general statement, obviously there are exceptions and some projects go better than others, etc.
Yeah, every project's a snowflake and there's little things to address, right? So the big thing for us is once you energize, so that's the HV energization, so you can actually get into the market, which is kind of the key one, I think, at the moment. Once you're in there and ready to go, you generally speaking, it's about 3 whole points, depending on the TNSP. They run it slightly differently. Each whole point takes about 3 to 4 business days to do, roughly. And then it's usually a week or 2 of review time. So about 3 of those. So it's about a 10-week commissioning, roughly.
Or it should be.
It should be. And there's things that come along the way, and you learn things along the way. And there's some really complex interconnection systems with the transmission network and runback schemes that you need to go through.
I ahead of this interview, I talked to a couple of people I know, and I said, well, what about all this Chinese stuff coming into the market? It's clearly going to be cheaper.
Right.
And the guy said, yeah, but Tesla tends to get the job done and it's reliable and commissioning record's pretty good. I suppose you'd be proud of that.
No, very proud of it. And look, the team has done an amazing job at Tesla to get there. I mean, we have some of the best power systems engineers in the world running on this, and I'm privileged to have them as part of the team. But yeah, the speed to market is really important because you have a lot of capital tied up in a project. Once that energization's on, you want to get that into market as soon as possible.
So without pointing the name, if you look at a battery in Canberra, I think that's, or even this battery in Waratah battery, it's got a great contract for 5 years.
Yep.
And if you miss a year of the 5 years, the financials don't look quite so good perhaps. So, execution in financial markets, being able to execute was always something that the fund managers loved. Sorry.
No. It's interesting, actually, just on those 2 batteries. And those are 2 players who are kind of new to the market. And we may not see them again. One, because we're not too sure whether they're going to survive the Trump tariff administration. But it's an incredibly complex market, I guess.
Yeah.
And complex issues in dealing with AEMO and dealing with the networks.
Yep.
And doing that sort of proof of concept, and then just sort of doing it.
Yeah, look, it is a complex market, and it's it's why I love working in the energy market. And if you ever look at the Australian power system, these are the most complex systems which we've created as humans, right? So the NEM itself is like I think it's probably the longest and skinniest power system in the world. The WEM's unique because it's the most isolated power system with no interconnection and massive levels of rooftop solar, and they're all subtly different. So working with the market operator, with the TNSPs to make sure that those systems interact correctly and are predictable, so those systems operate so the power system operates in a secure and reliable state. That's really important to get that confidence.
But there's this big debate now about exactly what batteries can do, and I guess the evolution from Hornsdale has been extraordinary. I mean, you systems control and the SITs, which is the sort of the backup thing for the network. Now you've led the way in grid forming inverters.
That's right.
Now there's this big debate about, well, can we actually not have spinning machines in the grid?
Yep.
If we're just having inverter-based technologies running the grid because we're going to shut down the coal-fired power stations.
Yep.
Do we need to have gas generators spinning away in the background?
Yeah.
Do we need synchrons?
Yeah.
What's your position on this? Because this is a very live debate, both in the engineering roadmap for AEMO and also their system planning, the ISP, and the way some of the networks are managing.
Yeah, look, in a way, I think the level of the innovation of technology has kind of have driven the market, right? So when we first turned on Hornsdale, I remember talking to the AEMO and the ops team, and they were saying, "Well, how fast can this thing ramp?" And I said up to 100 megawatts, and I was like, "Oh, probably 200 or 300 milliseconds," and that because they were expecting, maybe a minute to ramp up.
I think Marek Kubik pointed out to me that there was a battery in Ireland that just preceded the Hornsdale one that demonstrated just how fast they could do ramping and unloading.
So basically, we had to actually artificially slow down the ramp rate such that the 4-second AGC signal, because to a battery, 4 seconds may sound fast, but to a battery, it's glacially slow. So what we've actually had to modify the ramp rate so it's kind of moves follows the dotted line. All right, but so as we did that, we found. Originally, it was the ancillary services market was a big one. It was about 50% of revenues at the time was ancillary services versus energy. And that was FCAS regulation, which is the following AGC signal, but also the contingency markets, and that's an autonomous frequency response. And then we also, as we move forward, those markets kind of, the energy market got deeper, right? And now we're seeing the FCAS markets a lot smaller percentage of the revenue. But we've also seen the markets evolve. So we've seen the very fast FCAS market, which is the 1 second raise and lower market, brought in, and that's really just to accelerate the level of participation by batteries, because before that the fast market was 6 seconds, and 6 seconds is actually pretty slow.
Just on the technical side, Stephen Sproul was always wanting to, who's an engineer, was always wanting to emphasise to me that virtual inertia is mathematically almost the same as spinning inertia when you work it right out. And it's different to very fast frequency. It's sort of the system running itself. Could you maybe just? I'm a financial analyst. Could you maybe just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, look, and it's a good question. And I think one of the challenges for the industry, particularly for electrical engineering, is we kind of sometimes talk in a little bit of code and make it a little bit inaccessible. So I'm always damned, if I overly simplify it, someone engineering colleagues going to say, well, come on, what are you saying there? Or if I overly complicate it, I'll lose the audience, right? But if we think about the power system, the power system started, there was a war of the currents in the 19th century, AC came out on top, and we've been relying on synchronous generation for our power system for 150 years, and that was the basis of prosperity in Australia and the synchronous generation. That was how it happened. But as part of that, we just relied on the assumptions that there was a spinning magnetic mass and it resisted the change to voltage, and it gave us a little bit of leeway in the power system. So as we are displacing those synchronous generators, and we're seeing that globally, power system market operators globally are grappling with this problem. How do we replace that? And so we came up with the grid forming inverters, and what we call the virtual machine mode. And really, what drove that was the inverter technology. So moving from traditional IGBTs, which have in wind turbines and solar, we moved to a silicon carbide switching, and that operates at a much higher frequency, so about 60 to 80 kilohertz. And that means, if you think about, there's 50 hertz in the voltage in the network. So every cycle has about 1,000 points to define it. So that means we can start controlling that waveform at a much higher fidelity. And so if we think about what does a synchronous generator do as we replace it, there's a few things it does, which we try and replicate through power electronics now. And because the power electronics at the speed, we can do that. And part of that is the voltage stability, so the resistance to change. So as the amplitude starts distorting or the frequency starts changing, we can, at the sub-cycle, so and this is like in the milliseconds, start correcting that waveform. And that's part of what we call system strength, and that's what synchronous generators just do by the benefit of having rotating mass. And there's inertial response, so that's resistance to change in frequency. So as you lose generation, as it was an imbalance, we can either go too low or too high, and that's an injection of power as a result of that. And synchronous generation and inertia, it's simple. It's just you've got a rotating mass as the reference signal, which is the grid, starts slowing down. The rotating mass is captured by that and just resists it and starts injecting power. But you can do that with power electronics very simply. And that's the response to the change of rock-off, the rotor change frequency.
Yes, right. And I'll hand back to Giles in a second. But as I said, I'm a financial analyst. But before, I read quite a lot of work as an amateur about what people envisaged of the power system of the future.
Yep.
Where you had like voltage as a currency and a fully distributed kind of network where you had these grid-forming inverters sitting at the end of every street in one vision of it.
Right.
And that as they sensed that they needed to inject or take more power, I guess the question is, can you have all these grid-forming inverters working together, or are they always going to be getting out of tune, is the word I'll use.
Right. I mean, we've been operating, for at least 5 years in the NEM. We converted Hornsdale to once we did the stage 2, 150 megawatts of full grid forming. Most of the projects we're doing now are grid forming, and we're doing that at the transmission level. We're not seeing that intergenerational oscillations, which is a big thing which we look through as part of the grid connection process and part of the whole point testing. They're not seeing that. Could you do it at a distribution level? Look, you probably could, but the idea one of the fundamental concepts of the system security is that transmission network is the backbone. And that's where the large generators are. And that's where we really want to inject the big current to make sure that the grid reference is maintained.
But it's nice when there's a blackout because a tree fell on the wires that my house keeps operating and it must have its own grid-forming inverter with the grid within the house. Anyway, Giles.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's a good point, though, because you said, I think, before we started recording, you were talking about, you got small grids where the batteries form,
Yeah. Well,
why can't it be done on the bigger scale?
Yeah, no, and absolutely it can be. And I think what we will see, I mean, if we look at the house, the residential context, and then we can talk about the transmission context. The residential batteries, the Powerwall, for example, is a grid-forming inverter as well. It's the same fundamental architecture on the inverter. If you do lose the power to the street, it disconnects islands and then recreates in grid-forming mode. And we run with solar and loads, and you can run 24/7. We've had customers being off grid for. Actually, one of the tech support guys said that someone was off for like 3 or 4 weeks and didn't know they were off grid.
I can actually believe that. We had a blackout, and I've said this on the podcast before.
Yeah.
And even though it was only on one circuit, it was most of the stuff we were using that the Powerwall went. And it wasn't until my wife went upstairs to our painting studio and said the air conditioning's not working. Can you call a technician?
Yeah, right.
That I went out and looked at the switchboard and saw
it was like, you've been off, right? Yeah, exactly. So, but it is important in that context because a lot of the distributed, so CER or DER, the fundamental concept there was anti-islanding. Was if we lost the connection to the street, or a tree fell across a distribution wire, we wanted to make sure we weren't backfeeding into the grid, such that there was a shock hazard for line workers, right? And that's why we have to disconnect. So that's important. But I think at the transmission level we have the same concept, and that's called the system restart ancillary services. My career goal is to get a battery onto that contract. And that's how we restart the grid in a black start scenario.
Yeah, and couldn't do any worse than the gas generators did in South Australia after the blackout there, could they? I mean, they did a hopeless job, but we shouldn't revisit history too much, should we?
No, but I'm kind of interested because, we've heard in the engineering roadmap and AEMO, that we've had moments when we could have had potential 100% renewables. They've admitted that they're not quite ready to go there because they're sort of worried about the need for spinning machines and synchronous generation. We've seen a lot of synchronous condensers being rolled out in places like New South Wales and other places like that. So there seems to be this mentality that we still need spinning machines. But if I understand it correctly, your argument is that a lot of those assumptions with spinning machines and providing that inertia, it's like an old way of doing it's an old system.
Right, yeah.
And under the new system, you don't actually need that much inertia in the way that people traditionally thought about it.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it's really important that we say that the power systems operates in a secure and reliable state. So the secure is we make sure we have enough inertia and system strength on the network, and that's why we have a lot of the AMO directions for gas turbines to operate when power prices are low, because we need that system security. That's important. I think as we move forward, we're going to see a more of a reliance on grid-forming inverters. Look, I think 10 years from now, personally, I feel like the majority of that system strength will be provided by grid-forming inverters, purely because one of the great things about a battery is that even when it's sitting there doing no dispatch, it's providing the inertial and system strength services 24/7, whereas a synchronous generator needs to be spinning, needs to be running or dispatched.
And the other thing is that you see for synchronous condensers is this thing fault current, where the argument is that grid-forming inverters and batteries don't provide as much fault current. I don't really understand that all that well. Could you explain it to a simpleton?
No, definitely not a simpleton, David. But fault current, and I think fault current was really a bit of a proxy to in the old days, before we had some of the high power grid modeling software like the PSCAD modeling, now the EMT, what we call EMT analysis, because it was really hard to model at that sub-cycle level. Before that, it was a bit of a proxy. It's like, oh, we've lost X generator with that much fault current, so we've got to replace it with Y. Right now, we're doing a lot more analyses, first principles analyses, to show that the system can operate in a secure state. There is a role for fault current, same as in a house. If you put your finger in the toaster, you want to have enough current going through to trip the breaker upstream. We have RCD breakers now to kind of just prevent that, but in the old days, you had to get the current above the breaker rating. We have the same in the transmission and distribution networks. If there's a fault, from a phase to ground or a phase to phase, and it goes to 0 volts, that current's got to go through to clear the breaker to open it, right? And that's fault current. But I don't see that as a major impediment in the power system moving forward. The reality is, though, you're providing that fault current through power electronics, and there's a current limit on that power electronics, right? So you usually get a bit less of the actual rated fault current coming through the inverters.
I see. It's the current limit on the inverter. Yeah. Thank you.
And what's sort of the biggest challenge here? Is it sort of technical? Is it sort of vested interest? Is it a philosophy about engineering and people being used to a certain system? I mean, AEMO is often described as trying to change your engines mid-flight. I don't know whether that's a valid argument or not. But
look, I think it's a valid argument. I think, system operators around the world are going through the same thing, because it's a unique system where it's 24/7. Society expects energy to be available 24/7. We can't shut down, retinker and restart it back up. So it needs to be on the fly, right? And so I think AEMO does a great job in coordinating that and into sort of phasing that through. So I feel that particularly with grid-forming inverters, it's part of, like, we're changing fundamentally the way we're generating energy and consuming energy as a society. We're going from a really centralized generation profile to a bit of centralized, but also distributed generation, rooftop solar. We're seeing, I saw your article, was it today or yesterday, in negative demand. So we've got actual distribution level solar into the transmission system, the stuff which was alien 50 years ago to system planners, right? So we need to have that evolutionary approach. I don't think we're just going to stop doing synchronous generation, or we're going to stop doing synchronous condensers. But I think we'll need to sort of build that experience and that competence up with grid-forming inverters and slowly move through. But the thing with synchronous condensers one of the big problems I kind of see with synchronous condensers is there's a big lead time to get them in, and they're a net load on the system. But also, once the drivetrain or the rotor is designed and the mass is there, it's not tunable. Like that inertial constant set.
So I think the point Giles was making too was that the rotating mass is a very heavy inertia system. It's like you're riding a very heavy bicycle. Whereas with it's been explained to me that you can have a very light system, so you only need small signals to correct it rather than big signals. And maybe the synchronous condensers, am I hearing you right? And we shouldn't talk too much about this stuff. Right. Get in the way of that a little bit.
Yeah, look, the heavier the response, the more there's bigger changes to slight perturbations.
Yeah. It's a big year for sort of reviews and policy and engineering decisions.
Yep.
We've got the Nelson Review on markets. We've got a new version of the Integrated System Plan.
Yep.
I don't know, which one do you want to tackle first? Because obviously you guys have got a strong opinion, and decisions made now are going to have a big influence on how things get rolled out.
Yeah.
The speed of them and the success of them over the next couple of years.
Yeah, yeah. Look, there's definitely a lot of reviews going on. But I feel that we've got an energy-only market here in the NEM. In the WEM, they've had an established capacity market for
the WEM,
a
just
while.
to point out, is the West Australian energy market.
Yes,
basically.
West Australian energy market.
Yeah,
Sorry, there's way too many acronyms in our industry.
It's okay.
Right?
I thought I'd just get that one in.
But but in the NEM energy-only market, and that's the most economic dispatch. And at the time, we had an overcapacity in generation, and I think the energy-only market really got us there. We're now at this situation where it's really hard to estimate, what those cash flows, what those market revenues are going to be in 20 years. So there's signals for investment, and I think that's really at the heart of the Nelson.
So what
review.
do you want to see then in terms of sort of new markets? I mean, do you want to see a market for system strength? Do you want to see a different sort of capacity market, or what are the top three things that you want Tim to? Yeah, look, and his team to put together.
I think the essential system services, the ESS market, is definitely something which is going to be important, because we need to have a market to encourage that new generation, encourage developers to actually use grid-forming inverters, or some of them have it on, but it's not enabled, right? Because they don't want to go through a 539 process and the expense
which is
to
the registration
that,
process, which is very complicated.
Which can be very complicated. It's actually quite simple, but I think we overcomplicate it as an industry, in my opinion. But I think that's important. So the capacity investment scheme goes a way to do that. I think pure capacity markets can be definitely less efficient. So I feel like there's the CIS and I think they call them the long-term fungible contracts to address the tenor issue. I think is a good direction in there as part of the Nelson Review.
And as pointed out by Anthony Fowler from Lockhart, the thing that really struck you about the CIS he mentioned, and what really hit me, was that it allows the generators to contract short, because they've got the security that if they have a bad year, the CIS is underpinning it and gives them time to recontract.
Well, I guess Tim Nelson's trying to work out what happens after the CIS.
Well, Joe's raised the really interesting point that we are moving into a world, it seems, where bulk energy will be largely renewable. Yep. And that is not a world that any of us have lived in, and it's very easy to make predictions, like people at universities who made predictions about what happened to telecoms markets when you deregulated and introduced spectrum bidding, and guess what? It turned out to be wrong. And so it's hard to know how the price, how a dispatch or a capacity market will work all that well when you seem to be going through periods of either abundance, like lunchtime, or shortage, and a June night in winter. I mean, it's hard to understand, and batteries, I suppose, have a huge role in evening that out, but then they might be empty.
No, batteries have a huge role to play in that. And I think, as we move to that bulk energy market, as you're saying on renewables, I mean, renewables, the short-run marginal cost is really low, right? So there will be periods where it won't be, we will have that abundant resource which we don't need to generate. And it's the same, it's an analogy to your rooftop solar, right? Particularly in the southern states, you have solar load for kind of winter. No, recognizing in summer you're going to be clipped and have too much solar, and infinite solar in a way. But I think that's the power system of the future. We're going to have periods of just really cheap, abundant batteries, renewables, and let's charge them while we can, but sometimes it will just make sense to not generate.
Going back to Giles again in a second, but let me just ask about the household battery market, because that's another new policy that's going to come into place on July 1st.
Yep.
And what I'm hearing is that people are having kind of only had household batteries, like I'm talking installers here, as kind of the thing they'll do when they've got nothing else to do and they didn't really care. Right. But now everyone's gearing up like crazy to get going on it. Yeah. How's your business? What are you seeing?
No, we're definitely seeing a major pickup in demand for Powerwall. Of course, there's always the pause before the storm, because everyone's reassessing and seeing how it will impact the economics. But there is definitely and that's what the home battery scheme, and I think it's been a really well administered scheme the way it's structured, particularly on the kilowatt hour basis, because it's not just a set price for any battery. So it encourages you to have the right size of battery. But what that does is it kind of levels off the economics, because it can be a difficult economic decision. Like rooftop solar is actually quite complicated when you work out, how much of this solar am I actually self-consuming, how much am I exporting to the grid for pretty much nothing now, right? Yeah. So it's actually quite a complicated ROI. And when you're sitting around the family table trying to work it out, it can be quite complicated. Batteries, again, is another level of complication.
I'm not going to ask you to comment, but I particularly, but the gossip I'm hearing is that the household battery price has already declined quite materially since the announcement, or maybe that was already happening. And with the subsidy included, you're down at, like $400 a kilowatt hour for some batteries. Whoa. When my Powerwall, which has given me fantastic service and will continue to do so, but it certainly wasn't $400 a kilowatt hour.
I suspect if it's $400, it's probably come something through the mail, and may not be a brand that you recognise or remember.
No, this was a respectable brand, because we're going to get this integration, aren't we, of the DC inverter into the battery. So you're only going, it's going to be more of a plug and play, which will be easy to install as well as everything else.
Yeah. So we've launched the Powerwall 3 now, which is a lithium iron phosphate battery, 3.5 kilowatt hours, but includes the PV inverter. So we run the MPPT trackers directly, the power electronics for that directly on the Powerwall, so it bypasses the need for the PV inverter, and that has a lot of benefits as well, because it means we can avoid some of those constraints on solar, because it's going straight into the DC side, so we don't need to have that grid interactive side on the solar.
Can you tell us anything about vehicle to grid then?
Vehicle to grid,
because you guys happen to make quite good electric vehicles.
And
make good batteries.
Yes, we do. Yes, we definitely do.
Maybe you're ever thinking of connecting the two?
Yes. So I think it's a logical move, right?
Yeah.
So one of the big things for me, if you have a look at the way the EV market's moving, particularly in Australia, there's definitely picked up a lot of pace. I think we have roughly, a little over 100,000 EVs, or the Model 3s, Model Ys, including the old S's and X's, and a couple of Roadsters there connected, and then M and in the WEM. One of the things is the charging load itself, right? This is starting to get more significant, I think, and I think market operators are seeing that. You see that in the ISP, the expected demand from EV charging as we electrify from ICE vehicles. But one of the big things is to modulate or to control that charging. You can do it passively, and I think hats off to the retailers, particularly Origin and AGL have come up with some really innovative products, which is the point of the retailers, which I think is great, to encourage EV uptake. So 8 cents per kilowatt hour, which is
to the extent that networks bloody well let them do it. Excuse my language. Yeah, well, because networks have their own tariff ideas. Right. And sorry, I didn't mean to get you off topic.
But that encouraged passively to charge during the windows, which is typically like midnight till 6 a.m. because that's when the power price is cheaper. And you can do that through you can set that up in the scheduled charge in the vehicle. And that's one way, but also we can do the API control of the load, so we can turn it up and down as required. And then that's probably the low hanging fruit. Right now, we're not doing a lot of that, right? So there's gigawatts of charging load which we're not controlling or modulating.
So from the grid perspective, there's a big argument to sort of say that that's probably the best way to address it, is sort of controlling loads and charging times.
I think controlling load is a big one.
Yeah. Definitely. From a consumer perspective, though, they kind of think and I thought the same thing when a cyclone come through Byron Bays. I've got 2 Teslas sitting in the driveway and I've got no power.
Yeah.
Can I please plug it in?
Yeah, right. No, and then this is the question. And so there's a bit of debate, I think, in the industry on how we do that vehicle to grid connection. If you do it on AC, so the inverter on the vehicle. Because if you think about a vehicle is a three-phase inverter running a synchronous generator. Really, that's how it works. So you can connect that inverter to the household, but it may be a couple hundred kilowatts. Well, you could, right? But it could be a couple hundred kilowatts.
I bet there's someone that does it. I bet you any money there are people out there that do that.
Yeah, exactly. So, but you obviously don't want to connect a 100 kilowatt inverter to a household with a 10 kilowatt feed. Because that could be
at school. At the school I went to when we were doing homework at night, which no one was interested in Armidale winter night, people would just take the out of the bar radiators. They'd stop working, so they'd pull the thing out of the middle and put a coat hanger in.
Yeah, well, but you can also do it on the DC side, right? And so the DC bus on the vehicle, which is a 400 volt bus, can connect through to a level 3 charger, and then you can have that through there. But look, I think ultimately, we've got some products which we'll be releasing, relatively soon on AC connecting the system, because that's the cheapest way. However, there are network problems and restrictions and
the networks have got some rules.
Well, look,
I have a Valium.
No, I definitely understand. If you don't do it correctly, you can lead to like tripping off houses, right? So that's part of the cumulative inverter connection requirements. A lot of the DNSPs have said that if you have a vehicle to grid, that is included as part of that. And then I think there's the element of what's best for consumers. Like the consumers own this vehicle, they want it to be ready. They want to be up in the morning and they want to drive to work. They want to have it fully charged. The nightmare scenario is we have this vehicle to grid and it's dispatching into the market and you earn a couple of dollars from the spread, and then your vehicle's like
well,
in the morning.
I don't know. I personally just have a time of use tariff, and when I want to charge the vehicle, I plug it in at night time because I know it's overnight rates, and I don't. It's just the most convenient way, I'm always, and we've debated it on here quite a few times with people about whether it's better to just let the markets work by having tariffs, or whether you've got to give someone control of the whole thing. AEMO, Gentail, and Network, they all want to own my equipment and tell me what to do with it. But I'm always of the view that done properly, for a large amount of the time, the consumers will behave if you give them the right price signals.
Yeah, I'm very much a big believer in the price signals for the market, and it's also the lowest cost to consumers. Because one of the issues we do have is if we have too much of this command and control architecture and the network servers, and a lot of the costs for this are recovered through the regulated asset base, and that increases the cost to consumers. So it's a balance, and these are all debates which we need to have as an industry as we develop.
Let's get back to sort of the bigger picture on the grid, and I'd love to very shortly sort of get your vision of what that grid's going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time. But we're seeing this sort of the big battery that you're building in WA now is 4-hour battery. There's now new requirements coming in that sort of new batteries must be 6 hours. So tell us about the sort of difference between a 4 and a 6 and 8 hour battery, and what's possible, what are the costs, what's reasonable, what's useful.
And these are great questions. There was a lot of discussion about long duration energy storage, LDES, and how that would work, and what the price point was when we transitioned from lithium ion to flow batteries. But I think what we've seen fundamentally, in the industry, is that the level of innovation and competition in the Chinese EV market has led cell producers to mass commercialization, similar to what we saw, I think, with the solar panels, probably 10 years ago, and that price point really crashed down. And an EV, and a battery for an EV is fundamentally a 4-hour cell, right? Because if you think about it, you got to drive 400 kilometers, right? 4 hours, it's 100 kilometers an hour, roughly. And you've got periods of high power, right, and charging, but basically it's around 4 hours, and that's kind of spurned into the energy storage market. Particularly, one of the big technology changes which I've noticed is in the early days, particularly Hornsdale, we were using the nickel, cobalt,
manganese,
in the cathode, and a bit of manganese, and there's cobalt in the cathode, in the lithium cathode. Now it's really moved to lithium iron phosphate, which is a bit of lower voltage, but it's definitely the price point is dropped.
And safer in a lot of ways, is it?
Yeah, well, look, it's a lower voltage, and depending on how we define safety, like I think any energy storage system is inherently is some risk because there's energy storage in there, right? But I think what we've seen through that is that 4-hour price point is plummeted, right? It's plummeted.
Can I ask, because I talked to a lot of people about this, and I think there's no doubt the cell prices have come down. Yeah. I'm not sure about inverters, what's happened there, but then you've also got all the other balance of system costs and things, and connection costs and whatever. Yeah. And so that the translation in cell costs is not really what we're seeing in the overall installed costs of systems. I mean, the numbers I've heard quoted still around 625 Aussie $1,000 per megawatt hour or something like that. Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not asking you to comment on that, but it's not, it's not the same way that cell costs have come down.
I mean, what's within our control at Tesla is that system, and we've made a real effort to vertically integrate, so to do the inverters in-house, to do the storage assembly and the cooling system, the control system, as much as we can in-house to reduce that price point. Yes, that price point's definitely dropped on storage, and I think that's great. That's just a testament to the innovation and scale in the industry, and that's why we're seeing fundamentally why there's massive rollout in the last year or so.
So what's the logical? What's the end point then for the hours of storage? I mean, can it just keep on getting longer and longer and longer, or is it just the point where it's not useful?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. Like when I first started, I remember talking to some of the customers and saying, "Oh, we've got a 2-hour product," and they were like, "Oh, we don't need a 2-hour product. We just need a 15-minute product." And then now, as most of our projects are kind of moving to 4 hours, it depends on the energy market how deep it is. But fundamentally, that first hour, that first 2 hours, if we look at the
first hour is more valuable than the last hour.
Yes.
That's your cost drops per hour, your unit
That's right.
cost, but so does the value.
That's exactly. So I think now we're kind of moving to that 4-hour price point is super competitive. I think you can go to 8 hours, and look, we're doing the Limondale battery with RWE. That's an 8-hour battery, but that's fundamentally the 4-hour product, and we're just reducing the generation. So you can operate, if you got 100 megawatt hours, you can run it at 100 megawatts, you can run it at 10 megawatts.
Well, that's the point. I really think in the end, power is more important than duration. People always think about the discharging of it, but actually it takes a lot longer to charge as well. And so when you look at when you often need batteries, it's when there's these wind and solar droughts, and your charging opportunities windows might be quite small. And having lots of power for an hour or two at lunchtime can be just as important as being able to do it for 20 hours. Anyway.
Yeah.
That's just important. Yeah. One last question before I get to the sort of the future. The ISP is coming up.
Yep.
We're sort of getting to the end of the time, but ISP. Any particular requests or observations there? Lots of discussions about the cost of transmission networks. Lots of discussions about the role of batteries as virtual transmission.
Yep.
You got any thoughts on that?
Yep. Look, one of the quotes I really like was from Niels Bohr, who was like one of the physicists on the Manhattan Project, and he said, "Predictions are really difficult, particularly about the future." And I feel like that's part of kind of where we're at. We've all got our crystal balls on where it's going to go, but who would have thought we would have had the geopolitical changes we've had in the last year? Who would have thought we had the Ukraine 3 years ago and the gas prices going up? So things will change, and it's about being resilient and adapting to that. I think fundamentally there'll be more renewables on the grid for sure. I think the coal closures are happening. It's not like we can maybe try and extend them out a little bit, but they're getting to the end of their design lives. But we need to replace that energy, right? So if you look at Loy Yang A, if we take Loy Yang A off, it's about 16, 17 terawatt hours. You need to put 16 terawatt hours back on the grid. You need probably 8 to 10 gigawatts of renewables to get that energy into the system.
The Victorian government's got an offshore wind scheme just for you. Huh?
Yeah, right.
So tell me about your vision then of the future. I mean, do you think we're going to get to 82% renewables by 2030 and what needs to be done to get there?
Right.
And let's get to 2035 when the last of the coal-fired power stations may be exiting the grid or about to exit the grid. What does the grid look like then?
Yeah, right. Look, as an engineer, the technology is there. The technology solution is there. I don't think it's a question of can we do it. We can definitely do it. Definitely do it. But my area of influence is really on that system design and rolling out product and integrating and running it. But there's a whole bunch of societal issues we need to go through on planning reform and transmission and the financing and the Nelson Review and how that kind of works out. But they're all questions for us as a society to agree on. But the technology fundamentally is there to run a 100% renewables grid.
I wish everyone believed. I mean, of course, we all believe that. Most people listening to this podcast believe that.
Right.
But it's equally perfectly obvious that there's a lot of people that just, for one reason or another, refuse to believe that or refuse to say they believe it.
Yeah. But also, I do think like if we think about it logically, as we go to the 100%, there's cost to get to 80% to 90% to 100%. There is a diminishing return. So I feel that there will probably be a role in gas for this this Dunkelflaute concept, which is a great term. There will be an increasing role. We've seen gas. Look, the electricity market has been steadily declining. Will that increase? Yeah, will it be a big player? No, it's going to be those kind of areas of.
But we're going to get to, by then it's 95, 96, 97% renewables and what have you. Yeah. And what about the role of the homes then? Because, you've got your home batteries, you've got your electric vehicles, you've got rooftop solar. As I wrote and you observed, Electronet's already seen negative demand on multiple occasions on its grid. Now, it thinks that might not continue because there will be load from electric vehicles and other businesses. But it is a fundamentally different way of thinking about the grid rather than central and spokes going out.
Look, fundamentally, we are changing the power system to being consumers. We can consume when prices are flexible consumption and also generation and dispatch into the market, which is pretty exciting considering where we've come from. I think there will be definitely an element of one of the great things about rooftop solar and why it's been so successful, over 3 million systems, is that we have an amazing solar resource.
Yes.
There's rooftops everywhere.
Yes.
It doesn't require much planning
Perfect-
permits or good
perfect
connections
market-
or
perfect market
to
for
put them
rooftop.
on to get energy into the market. I think I think there's something there which is important. I think the AEMO ISP recognises that, and you can see that in the amount of rooftop solar and consumer energy resources required to run the NEM. Can you run the NEM, or the WEM on half of more than half of residential supply? Yeah, you can. Right? Yeah, we can.
Electrons are electrons.
Electrons are electrons.
Can I just ask one more question
Sure.
about the supply side, as you see it? That is the supply of the components that you need. Well, you don't need panels, but like for the batteries. I mean, manufacturing capacity and just the level of inquiry that you're still seeing for the future market. We know there's a huge amount of. We've discussed what's been built and commissioned already. But what about the more forward orders and the more forward indicators? What's your feeling?
Yeah, I think we're seeing globally, definitely increased demand through that. And we opened up our Shanghai factory, Mega Factory Shanghai this year, so that all of the Australian projects now are coming from Shanghai.
20 gigawatt hours initially, I think, of manufacturing capacity.
Oh, very good, David, very good. But we'll be expanding that probably to close to 40 fairly shortly. We've got and so that will be covering most of Asia Pacific and probably Europe because of the tariff situation which we have. And look, it's the supply and demand. As that demand builds, the market, there's a lag in the market capacity coming online, but definitely the capacity coming online in China has been amazing to see. Particularly if you go to China and you see the scale of storage and EVs being rolled out there, and PV and wind, it's pretty humbling what's happening.
And that's right, and that's interesting. And then in Australia, as I said, there's a lot been built and commissioned, but probably once the coal generator's closed, we're going to need a lot more, aren't we? So is it?
Yeah, and I think that's the fundamental part of the Nelson review, is recognising that we don't want to wait till the coal turns off and then have scarcity and high prices, then build and rely on that energy only market signal. There'll be a recognition we're going to have a level of overcapacity and transition through, and that's going to be a bit of a jittery transition. I think that's going to be an exciting thing for a lot of people working in the industry now over their careers. Like the rest of my career, I'm sure will be part of that, transitioning through.
It's an exciting time, really, if you're in the electricity industry.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to remember there's a lot of other industries as well, like medical science and other things that not everyone just wants to talk electricity all day.
You will need power. Yes. Well, what are the biggest hurdles then, Joseph? I mean, is it sort of aging engineers, politicians?
As an aging engineer, probably.
We'll rule that one out straight away.
But no, I think there's a lot of challenges which we need to do. I think it's not just an engineering solution. I think, or an engineering problem. I think there's some planning issues. There's definitely some financing issues. There's some social licensing issues, which equity issues as part of this transition. There's a lot of things to tackle. But on the technology side, I am very much convinced that the technology is there to do the transition. It's just the will of how we do that.
Well, it's been fascinating having you join us on the Energy Insiders podcast. It's actually been quite a pleasure. Actually, we should get a studio all the time, David. I think
Giles, as I was going to say, the inaugural studio podcast that. The podcast Mark II.
The podcast Mark II. We're entering into a new era. There you go. Joseph, thank you very much for joining the Energy Insiders podcast.
No, thanks for having me, and keep doing what you're doing, guys. Well done.
Thanks very much. Most enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, David, thank you for making the trip up from Sydney.
I got to ride a Lime scooter out there for about 8 or 9 kilometres. It cost me $30. So
I know, it's outrageous, isn't it?
No. They should be paying me, considering the quality of the suspension on the roads. But anyway.
Oh, look, we came up here actually just for getting diverted, yes, and there was 3 of us, and we rented 3 Lime scooters to go somewhere. God, unbelievable.
You couldn't afford to go home. Yeah?
Well, yes, anyway. Look, now I've forgotten where I am. I think I'm thanking everyone. Thanks, David. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, everyone out there listening. Thanks to our sponsors, Pylon and Evergen. And we'll be back with no news this week because we're recording this before I disappear on holidays. But we'll be releasing this, and then we'll be back again next week with a normal format. So look forward to speaking to you then. Bye for now.